What is up, ladies, gentlemen, and NBs? Welcome to the Rabbit Hole. I'm your perfect and humble leader, Chris Valenti, and today we're going to be doing a deep dive into the Alien and Sedition Acts. Here in Rabbit Hole, we like to look at something historical and go through the rabbit hole to today's political event and show you how every action has a reaction, and the things that you are living in today are consequences of decisions that were made fucking hundreds of years ago. See, we're going to cover the Alien Sedition Acts and its inception because of Donald Trump's current deployment of the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to illegally detain people and deport them to a concentration camp in El Salvador known as CCOT. Before we do, I want to remind you to like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. It costs you nothing and it helps me immensely. If you do want to help the channel financially, you can buy some dope-ass merch down below. You can use the 40% off discount code for the Vantage subscription on Ground News, and you can become a member for $5, which will give you early access to these videos, and it will give you access to a members-only playlist. So, without further ado, why don't you grab yourself a drink and a snacky poo, and let's take a deep dive into the Alien and Sedition Acts. So, the Alien and Sedition Acts were laws that were enacted in 1798 that applied restrictions to immigration and speech in the United States. The Naturalization Act of 1798 increased the requirements to seek citizenship, and the Alien Friends Act of 1798 allowed the president to imprison and deport non-citizens. Now we get to the juice, which is what we're dealing with right now. The Alien Enemies Act of 1798 gave the president additional powers to detain non-citizens during times of war, invasion, or predatory incursion. The Sedition Act of 1798 criminalized false and malicious statements about the federal government. The Alien Friends Act and the Sedition Act expired in 1800, and the Naturalization Act was repealed in 1802. The Alien Enemies Act, as amended, is still in effect as 50 U.S.C. ch. 3. So what's important about this is this point right here. The Alien Enemies Act gives the president additional powers during times of war, invasion, or predatory incursion. So as we know, right now, the United States is not actually in an active war. Granted, we are funding genocides and we are funding Ukraine's defense, and we have like operations against Houthi terrorists, but the thing is, because they're a terrorist organization, you don't need congressional approval and you don't need to declare war. But what you're seeing right here is that historically, these powers have only been given to the president during times of war. And right now, with Donald Trump's recent invocation of this Alien Enemies Act of 1798, it is the first time in American history that we have given the President of the United States powers of a wartime president while we are not actively in a war. All right, so let's go over just a little bit of the use of it. The first use that we have of it is during the Quasi-War. The Quasi-War was an undeclared war from 1798 to 1800 between the United States and the French First Republic. It was fought almost entirely at sea, primarily in the Caribbean, and off the east coast of the United States, with minor actions in the Indian Ocean and Mediterranean Sea. Excuse me again. I'm sorry for burping in your ear if you're using headphones. But see, during the Quasi-War, which was an undeclared war against the French, there was even during this, there was very little use of the Alien Sedition Act. But what it was used for was to detain suspected French spies who were known to be French nationals, right? The French were one of our oldest allies. They are our oldest allies, despite them recently asking to take the Statue of Liberty back. But there were fucking Lafayette was one of our main instruments during the fucking inception of the nation. But regardless, there were so many French people within the United States that at the time of this Quasi-War, the powers that be decided that we should have the ability to detain suspected spies with the nation that we are currently at war with, right? So it has nothing to do with undocumented immigrants who are a threat to the United States, and everything to do with being at war. Now, I want to highlight this one word here, invasion, right? It gives the president additional powers to detain non-citizens during times of war, invasion, or predatory incursion. Now, where have you heard the word invasion being tossed around left and right? Well, for the past 4 years, Donald Trump and the GOP have been claiming, incorrectly, falsely, that we are being invaded. that this nation is being invaded on the southern border. Now, that is not... that is entirely intentional, the word choice. They were trying to, what I call, grease up the treads, get people more and more used to saying the word invasion, 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 we're being invaded, so that eventually he could invoke the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, which is exactly what we're living through. Right? So the Quasi-War, it was a fucking bullshit war. It lasted 2 years. It didn't lead to any sort of big gripes between the United States and France. But the next use that we have of it is very minimal, but it is during the Civil War. See, during the Civil War, there was a lot of spies, right? During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, an avid consumer of intelligence, relied on a network of spies, including figures like Allan Pinkerton, Lafayette Baker, George Sharp, and Elizabeth Van Lew to gather information and disrupt Confederate operations, ultimately contributing to the Union victory. So, while we, the Union, the people who are on the right side of history, were deploying the use of spies to go infiltrate the Confederacy, the Confederates were doing the same thing. And at this time, officially, the Confederate States is a completely different nation. They had seceded from the Union. The Confederacy was no longer part of the United States, which meant that the Alien Sedition Act would consider anybody who was part of the Confederacy a non-citizen. As soon as you secede from the Union, you are no longer a citizen of the Union. So what do we see? We start to see Confederate spies being used. The Confederacy relied on spies like Belle Boyd and Rose O'Neal Greenhow to gather intelligence and disrupt Union operations, while the Union also employed spies like Elizabeth Van Lew to counter Confederate efforts. Now, why were they using women? Because the Alien and Sedition Acts, when it comes to the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, says that you could only detain male non-citizens. So even if you suspected somebody of being a spy, if they were a woman, you could not detain them. This is an example of the patriarchy biting itself in the ass, right? Where they were so sexist and were like, women can't be spies. We don't even need to detain women. That immediately they go, well, why don't we fucking use women as spies if they're not going to detain them? Just a little side note of the patriarchy just fucking itself. But we started to, and even though there was a lot of spies being thrown back and forth, there was still very little use of the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 during the Civil War. Even in a period of the American Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in U.S. history, even then we didn't find much use for it, because where are you going to deport people who were born in the fucking United States, right? So we're going to cover a little bit of the spying during the Civil War, right? Though neither the Union nor the Confederacy had a formal military intelligence network during the Civil War, each side obtained crucial information from spying or espionage operations. From early in the war, the Confederacy set up a spy network in the federal capital of Washington, D.C., home to many Southern sympathizers. The Confederate Signal Corps also included a covert intelligence agency known as the Secret Service Bureau, which managed spying operations along the so-called secret line from Washington to Richmond. As the Union had no centralized military intelligence agency, individual generals took charge of intelligence gathering for their own operations. General George B. McClellan hired the prominent Chicago detective Allan Pinkerton to set up the first Union espionage organization in mid-1861. Right? Confederate spies in Washington. Located 60 miles south of the Mason-Dixon line, Washington, D.C. was full of Southern sympathizers when the Civil War broke out in 1861. Virginia's governor, John Letcher, a former congressman, used his knowledge of the city to set up a nascent spy network in the capital in late April 1861, after his state seceded, but before it officially joined the Confederacy. Two of the most prominent early recruits were Thomas Jordan, a West Point graduate stationed in Washington before the war, and Rose O'Neal Greenhow, an openly pro-South widow and socialite who was friendly with a number of Northern politicians, including Secretary of State William Seward and Massachusetts Senator Henry Wilson. Right? The Sedition and Espionage Acts were designed to quash dissent during World War I. So you could see that even during the Civil War, which is quite possibly the bloodiest time period of American history, the use of the Alien and Sedition Acts was quite minimal. And we start to see it even incredibly minimal during the world's first World War, right? The Great War. World War I, we had an immense number of Germans in the United States, and even so, we barely interned them. The Sedition and Espionage Acts were designed to quash dissent during World War I. As the United States entered World War I, President Wilson and Congress sought to silence vocal and written opposition to the U.S. involvement in the war. So this is when we start to see the beginning of sort of the McCarthy era that we talked about in our previous video regarding McCarthyism, which is that when it comes to a time of war, right, simply having dissent against your own leadership can get you to be labeled as an enemy of the state. Right? And we see this, we saw this during the Red Scare, where people who were criticizing capitalism were labeled as anti-American communists, right? And the same sort of rhetoric was spawned in during World War I, right? And especially after the Russian Revolution in 1917. Before we do dive into a little bit of the World War I just want to show you just some early examples of anti-German propaganda and how propaganda is used, right? Destroy the mad brute. You see the German hat on there, and that is supposed to be Lady Liberty, probably France, right? And he's holding a bat of culture, just beating the German culture into her. Keep the Hun out, referring to the Germans as the Huns, with war-saving stamps. And the thing is, the Germans were the bad guys during World War I, but there were also tens of thousands of Germans living in the United States who had nothing to do with the conflict, right? So let's read a little bit of this. When the United States had finally decided to enter World War I in 1917, there was opposition at home by those who wanted America to remain neutral in the European conflict, and groups who actively opposed the draft, the first of its kind in the country. The most vocal dissent came from pacifists, anarchists, and socialists, many of whom were Irish, German, and Russian immigrants, and whose loyalty to America was openly questioned. Fearing the anti-war speeches and street pamphlets would undermine the war effort, President Woodrow Wilson and Congress passed two laws, the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, that criminalized any, quote, disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the U.S. government or military, or any speech intended to, quote, incite insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty, right? So let's look at what these are. Where are they? Right here. Okay. Give it to me. The Espionage Act of 1917. Whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully make or convey false reports or false statements with intent to interfere with the operation or success of the military or naval forces of the United States, or to promote the success of its enemies, and whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully cause or attempt to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, refusal of duty in the military or naval forces of the United States, or shall willfully obstruct the recruiting or enlistment services of the United States to the injury of the service or of the United States, shall be punished by a fine of not more than $10,000 or imprisonment for no more than 20 years, or both. So what does that mean in layman's terms? I know that it's fucking crazy. It means that if you say anything bad about the military or the United States during a time of war, you will be thrown in prison for 20 fucking years and given a $100,000 charge. It's $10,000, but that's back in 1917. Now, another act was thrown in, which is called the Sedition Act of 1918, okay? Wherever the United States is at war shall willfully make or convey false reports of the United... Let's get to the important here, the important juice here. Okay, shall willfully utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive nation in the form of the government of the United States or the Constitution of the United States or the military or naval forces of the United States, or shall willfully display the flag of any foreign enemy, or shall willfully urge, incite, or advocate any curtailment of production to advocate, teach, defend, or suggest that doing any of these acts or things in the section enumerated by those who shall word or act support in the favor of the cause of the country with which the United States is at war, or by word or act or oppose the cause of the United States therein, shall be punished by a fine of not more than $10,000. Okay, so what this means is that if you even teach anybody about bad things that the United States is doing during a time of war, you will also be considered an enemy, right? So the United States has always had laws embedded within our institutions to label any sort of dissident of the current administration as an enemy of the state and completely strip you of your civil rights. That has existed, but it has barely been used. And part of the reason why this was used was because of actual terror attacks, such as the Black Tom explosion. This happened in 1916, okay, in New Jersey. The Black Tom explosion was an act of arson by field agents of the Office of Naval Intelligence of the German Empire to destroy U.S.-made munitions that were about to be shipped to the Allies during World War I. See, before America was actually fighting in World War I, we were sending fuckloads of weapons and ammunition to the other nations that were part of it. And the Germans decided to send over a couple of spies and blow up our largest rail yard, which is in New Jersey, and it helped with like shipping weapons and ammunition overseas. This gave the American government the ammunition that they needed to start writing things like the Sedition Act, right? So let's move into what do we got here? I believe it's World War II. Oh no, now we have World War II. So we see the most widespread use of the Alien and Sedition Acts during World War II, right after the Pearl Harbor explosions. The U.S. government forcibly relocated and incarcerated approximately 120,000 people of Japanese descent, including U.S. citizens, in 10 internment camps following the attack on Pearl Harbor based on Executive Order 9066. Executive Order 9066. On February 19th, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the removal of all persons of Japanese ancestry from the western United States. The order led to the incarceration of approximately 120,000 people of Japanese descent, including U.S.-born citizens, okay? So, this means that, let's say the United States decides that it's going to go to war. This is like completely hypothetical, but in 2025, let's say the United States decides that it's going to go to war with China, right? This means that Donald Trump has the power to literally, with the fucking swing of a hammer, round up every last person of Chinese descent within the United States, even if they are born in the U.S., their parents are born in the U.S. It's the one-drop rule. If you or anyone in your ancestry has Chinese blood in you and the United States goes to war with China, you can be rounded up and thrown into a fucking detention center, most likely run by ICE. Actually, you will be rounded up by ICE, and it'll be run by somebody like Civic Core Geo Group, the private detention facility corporations that donated fucking $200 million to Trump's campaign. Oof. But this type of shit has already happened through U.S. history. And I really want to focus on the Japanese internment camps because we already know that it was unconstitutional. We had the Fred Korematsu case versus the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court ruled that every single thing that we did to the Japanese was unconstitutional, to the Japanese Americans, at least, that is, the people who we interned. And people don't know this, but we forced the Japanese to participate in slave labor in those camps. We forced them to start farming, and that food was used to send over to our boys overseas. A big part of the reason, and the thing is, we knew that many of these Japanese people were not actual threats to democracy, but we decided that it would be a useful way to create slave wage labor, which is exactly what we did with them. So, not only were, where is this? Oh, we don't need that. That's for later. That's for Trump. Not only were Japanese detained, but so were Italian Americans, so were German Americans. The internment of Italian Americans refers to the U.S. government's internment of Italian Americans during World War II. As was customary after Italy and the United States were at war, they were classified as enemy aliens. Some were detained by the Department of Justice under the Alien and Sedition Act. In practice, however, the U.S. applied detention only to Italian nationals, not to U.S. citizens, right? So what does this mean? It means that even though we have the Alien and Sedition Act and we were at war with the Italians and Germans, the systemic racism that was built in within the United States still overpowered the Alien and Sedition Acts. We had Italians and German civilians all throughout the United States, and we decided that we wouldn't throw them in detention centers. Why? Because they had white skin. They were of European descent. When it came to the Japanese, we didn't give a fuck. That's why we dehumanized them so much with the fucking propaganda, where we depicted them as actual literal monkeys rather than people. If you look at the anti-German propaganda from World War II, at least the Germans look like people. Evil people? Yes, but people nonetheless, right? So we can also move into a little bit of the detention of the Germans. Oh, well, never mind. We got the detention of the, what is this? Oh, 600,000 Italian Americans face some sort of repercussions. But When it comes to the Japanese, I mean, they really got it the worst. During World War II, we relocated and incarcerated 120,000 people of Japanese descent into 10 concentration camps operated by the War Relocation Authority, mostly in the western interior of the country. We've got some pictures of it here. These people were thrown onto fucking trains and sent to these camps where they were forced to participate in slave labor and also to maintain their own lives, right? Here's an example of them farming. I know some Republicans are going to look at this and go, hey, she was smiling. They must have been having a good time. Yeah, well, you know, people try to see the light when they're in a fucking era of darkness. Ouster of all Japs in California near. I am an American. Yeah, this is probably a Japanese-owned business. See, we put these fucking kids in the goddamn camps. They considered this kid to be a potential Japanese spy. It's abhorrent. It's absolutely abhorrent. Anyway, let's move on. So, the United States, after World War II, there was very little use of the Alien Sedition Acts during the Cold War because we were really just fucking thinking about launching nukes at each other into a global thermonuclear holocaust and just ending planet Earth as it was. But we did have the Fred Korematsu case. This is fucking decades after the internment of the Japanese. It was a landmark civil rights case. The Supreme Court upheld that the internment of the Japanese during World War II, ruling that the government's exclusion order was justified by military necessity and national security concerns. So the Supreme Court still ruled that it was okay to do, but they issued a fucking apology to them, right? Korematsu's case continues to be studied and debated, serving as a reminder of the importance of protecting civil liberties and the dangers of racial profiling and discrimination. In 1983, Korematsu's conviction was overturned into a separate court proceeding, and in 1988, the Civil Liberties Act apologized for the internment and provided reparations to those affected. So the best that you get from the government after they literally strip you of your civil rights and throw you into a fucking detention center is an apology. Sorry we did that, but there's not going to be any sort of repercussions. Nobody's going to be held responsible. And this is why I tell you guys, you got to be very careful about everything that you're doing right now. After 1989 and 1988, the furthest expansion of the Alien Sedition Act is what we see through the Patriot Act, right? If you know anything about the Patriot Act, it essentially just allowed the U.S. government to spy on every single one of us. The Patriot Act, signed into law in 2001, aimed to enhance national security after the 9/11 attacks by providing law enforcement with expanded tools to investigate and prevent terrorism, but also faced criticism for potential infringements on civil liberties. The Act's primary goal was to strengthen the government's ability to prevent and investigate terrorist activities, including financial ones. Financial terrorism is fucking hilarious. Expanded surveillance powers. It allowed for broader surveillance, including the ability to obtain warrants to search communications and financial records and to conduct secret intelligence surveillance, right? So all of this stuff is supposed to be targeted towards terrorists, right? Meanwhile, we have people like Donald Trump who are claiming that anybody who protests outside of a Tesla facility is going to be labeled as a terrorist and be sent to 20 years in a fucking El Salvadorian concentration camp. So right now, we are seeing the latest inception of the idea of you being an enemy of the state. It no longer has to do with us being at war with, because that's the thing. Donald Trump has invoked the 1798 Alien Enemies Act. Right? Here it is. Donald Trump invokes the 18th century law to speed up deportations, and judge stalls it hours later. Right? A federal judge barred the Trump administration Saturday from carrying out deportations under a sweeping 18th century law that the president invoked hours earlier to speed removal of Venezuelan gang members from the United States. U.S. District Judge James E. Boasberg said he needed to issue his order immediately because the government already was flying migrants it claims were newly deportable under President Donald Trump's proclamation to be incarcerated in El Salvador and Honduras. El Salvador already agreed this week to take up to 300 migrants that the Trump administration designed as gang members. So what ended up happening, we've covered this already. What ended up happening was the plane full of the Venezuelans who did not get a court date and they were not proven to be gang members. It was in the sky over international waters when a federal judge ordered Donald Trump to turn that plane around and give these men due process before sending them to a concentration camp. And because the plane was over international waters, Donald Trump said, "Fuck you," to the federal judge. And El Salvadorian President Nayib Bukele actually tweeted out and said, "Oopsie, too late." So your rights are in danger. We are going through a constitutional crisis, and Donald Trump is a fascist, right? And we're headed into an era where you don't have to be at war anymore. Excuse me. The President of the United States no longer needs to be at war to deploy wartime powers, right? Now, here's 4 things to know about the Alien Enemies Act and Trump's effort to use it, okay? Excuse me. Legal experts have long been skeptical about the Trump campaign promise and facet of the 2024 Republican Party platform to utilize the act during peacetime, since immigration hasn't historically constituted an invasion. This is why I said earlier the Trump regime has been saying the word invasion over and over and over again to try and grease us up and be okay with him using wartime powers by saying that we are being invaded, which we are not. Trump's proclamation was immediately blocked by a federal judge who ordered the deportation flights to turn around, though the administration still deported them. So Donald Trump does not care about the rule of law. They're literally just ignoring federal court orders. The Trump administration is seeking to circumvent the process that we have in our country in order to just expand power and do something with no process at all. Sky Perryman of Democracy Forward, which, along with the American Civil Liberties Union, sued over the administration's use of the law, adding, quote, "It's highly concerning and should be concerning for all Americans." History shows the risk. Now, this is exactly why we do what we do, is that if you look throughout history and you see what can be done with the invocation of something like the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, you look at what we have done with it and what could be done with it, and then you compare it with Trump saying that people who spew any sort of anti-Trump rhetoric are anti-American. Anybody who voted for Kamala Harris is a Marxist-Leninist communist, right? Anybody who, like somebody like Mahmoud Khalil, anybody who is pro-Palestinian, you're a terrorist. Anybody who protests Tesla, you're a terrorist. When you start this slippery slope of giving the president wartime powers, you probably hear Luigi digging next to me. When you start the slippery slope of giving the president wartime powers during peace times, you are quite literally forsaking your civil liberties and putting your own rights on the chopping block with the hope that they're not going to choose you because you're a cis white male, right? That's the problem here. Okay. The judge vows to determine if Trump administration ignored the order blocking deportation flights. Federal judge examining the Trump administration's use of the 18th century wartime power vowed on Friday to get to the bottom of whether the government defied his order. They did. I will get to the bottom of whether they violated my order. Who ordered this and what the consequences will be? Of course they fucking violated your order. Nayib Bukele tweeted out, "Oopsie, too late." I don't know why you need people like me to fucking hold your hand along the ride here. Oh, geez, we're very, very cooked. Late at night on March 14th, 2025, Trump invoked the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 against what he termed an invasion, he termed it, being perpetrated or attempted by Tren de Aragua, which nobody had ever even fucking heard of until this. At 7:28 p.m. on March 15th, U.S. Judge James E. Brosberg formally posted his written order to block the policy for up to 2 weeks, which was completely and utterly fucking ignored. So, what have we learned today through this deep dive, ladies and gentlemen? What we've learned is that the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798, right? The Alien Enemies Act of 1798, all these acts, the Sedition Act and the fucking Defense Act, all this shit, it is designed for wartime. It is designed to try and prevent foreign nationals and foreign spies from infiltrating our government during a time of war. And even during the American Civil War, it was barely used. Even during World War I, it was barely used. During World War II, it was incredibly heavily used to enact racist policies. And it was something that the Supreme Court even fucking apologized for decades later. So as we move into this new fascist regime, this new trolligarchy with the Fuhrer, Elon Musk on the top, people need to understand that as you give the president powers of a wartime president, you are putting yourself in danger. The very politicians who signed these bills are putting themselves in danger by giving the president these powers. These are not just pieces of paper. This is affecting people's fucking lives. The 300 Venezuelan migrants that were sent, one of them was a goddamn Venezuelan soccer player, okay? Part of like the Madrid soccer team or some shit. People are losing their rights around you. And all you need to do is recognize the patterns of history in order to see what's going on in front of your own very eyes, okay? That's all we got for today's rabbit hole. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. It helps me out immensely, and it's completely fucking free for you. If you do want to help the channel financially, you could buy some merch. You could also use the 40% off discount on Ground News, and you can become a member for $5 to get early access to these videos. Never stop fighting, folks. I'll catch you in the next video. Have a good one.